Hi, everyone. Hope you are doing well and are having a nice day and that you had a good weekend. Welcome to the Monday, April 6th lecture for American legislative process. So on the agenda for today, I want to give y'all a little bit of an update as to um, kind of where things stand for me. And again, I just want to reiterate too that I love hearing from you guys and getting emails from you and seeing your posts online. And I really miss meeting in person. And so it's nice for me to hear from you and hear that you're doing okay, hopefully, and trying to make sense of what has obviously turned out to be a super strange semester. And this may sound a little bit repetitive, but for me, things are still mostly the same. Thankfully, my family and I are all healthy. We have been hunkered down, obviously, still, and taking a lot of walks and trying to, my kid is 4 years old, and so trying to kind of navigate new reality with him without totally freaking him out about what's going on can be a little bit difficult. But nevertheless, we are hanging in there. So a few things I wanted to talk again, and I know that we talked last week about the annotated bibliography assignment, but I wanted to talk about it again. It's due on Friday, April 10th, so this coming Friday. But before we talk about that, I wanted to say a few words about the final paper topics, all of which have now been graded. So if you have not checked Canvas for your grade, you can go do that. And the papers were actually really good, I thought. The average grade was a B plus, which is great. A little bit higher than I expected, and actually checked a little bit higher than in previous semesters. Where some of you went wrong, and for this paper it wasn't really a problem, but I just want you to make sure that for the actual final paper, the third paper, you don't sort of fall into this trap of summarizing the legislation and kind of telling me why it was so important and why it was necessary, and kind of by extension how you feel about it, whether it was good or bad. And so a few things, like one, I should have no idea how you feel about this bill when your paper is finished. I should have no idea if you think it's good or bad or doesn't work or is an overreach of whatever. I just should not know that because it's not a part of the assignment. Remember, I want you to be an analyst, not a pundit, okay? So to that end, the focus of the paper has to be on the passage of the bill, right? So in your introduction, you need to bring it back to the passage of the bill, particularly when you write your thesis statement, which I'll talk more about in the coming weeks. You didn't need a thesis for this first final paper topic assignment, but you will obviously for the final paper. And so I want you to be thinking when you're writing the annotated bibliography, like how does this play into my argument of whether or not this bill was passed via what we think of as unorthodox lawmaking, right? That is the crux of the paper, not what the bill is about, not whether it worked, not whether it didn't work, but how was it passed, right? What were the motivations of the people that were involved? How do they deal with their constituents? What type of representation practices do they follow? All of those things, right? So again, the idea is not for you to tell me if the bill was good, bad, or whether it worked or not. Um, so we'll talk a little bit more about the annotated bibliography in just a second, but when we get to the kind of bulk of today's class, we're going to talk about decision making in Congress, what bargaining among lawmakers tends to look like, what is the concept of log rolling, and how do lawmakers use different strategies to get their sort of policy proposals and what they care about put into play. And then we're going to talk about Congress and the presidency. So we're moving into the part of the semester now where we're looking at how Congress interacts with the other institutions of government, right? And our focus will be mostly institutional from here on out for like the next 3 weeks, but with some sort of kind of individual analysis mixed in as well. So for the annotated bibliography, again, it's due Friday, April 10th. I went over this last week, but for the assignment, you have to annotate 10 outside sources, meaning they have to be, books, newspaper articles, journal articles, peer-reviewed pieces, etc., that we have not yet assigned in class, right? So you cannot annotate Richard Fenno, for example. Obviously, Wikipedia is not a source. Wikipedia is a great place to go to begin your research, as I'm sure that you are all aware. However, do not cite it as a source. You will lose points if you do that. In any Wikipedia entry, you can see the list of references down at the bottom. That's a good place to go to start, actually, trying to find a list of reputable references, but do not start by citing Wikipedia itself. And crucially, and this is sort of the main point of this assignment, for each of these 10 sources, you need 3 components, okay? You need a summary, just like what are they arguing, what's the point of view, what is the source about, what is this particular article about, etc. The second thing that you need is an assessment of the source. And so this is where you're comparing it with other sources that you found, right? So for example, if you're arguing that your bill was passed via unorthodox lawmaking, and you find 9 sources that give you evidence that that was the case, but the 10th source that you find says, no, actually, this is pretty traditional, then that's where you would talk about assessing the source, right? So like, this supports my hypothesis, this does not support my hypothesis, this goes against most of what I've read, this supports most of what I've read, whatever it is. And then the third part is the reflection piece of it. And this is where you really talk about how specifically it helps you to shape your argument, right? Because this source indicates that the bill went through whatever 6 different committees, that is a hallmark of unorthodox lawmaking. Thus, this helped shape my belief that the bill was passed via unorthodox lawmaking. You do not need an introduction. You do not need a thesis statement. You don't need the first paper. All you need are the 10 sources annotated, and you must follow the formatting guidelines that are laid out in the prompt. I'm not going to go through the prompt here because it's posted on Canvas in the assignments folder, but as long as you make the assignment look like the guidelines that I set forth in the prompt, you'll do fine. All right, you don't need to rewrite the beginning of the paper. Let me stress that again, of the first paper rather. You can go straight to annotating the sources. Okay? All right. On to a quick review, and then we will move into today's lecture. So if you remember, when we were talking about decision making in Congress, we talked about how members of Congress typically fall in one of 3 camps. And really, this is not even like for their entire career, but basically for each individual kind of political issue or political decision that they have to make. They could be considered early deciders, they could be considered active players, or late deciders. And I think we're all sort of ingrained to think that being an early decider is the best option. The early bird gets the worm. Obviously, it's good to stake out a position and fight for it. While this is true, and early deciders can actually go a pretty long way in helping to set the agenda, not only for what Congress thinks about and acts upon, but even what the American people are interested in. What early deciders enjoy in terms of setting the agenda, they tend to lack in terms of bargaining power. And that's because fellow supporters, right, or people who are on the fence, they know that you passionately support this project or this bill, whatever it is, and as a result, you don't have any leverage, right? Because your vote is a for sure yes vote. Additionally, if you're an early decider, and let's say you decide yes, then you're kind of boxed in terms of your constituents, right? Because they, if you change your mind and vote no, could think of you as kind of a flip-flopper, somebody who doesn't have much of a backbone politically. And so it can be a difficult deal, right? On the other hand, if you're somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right, who came out very early with her big plans for the Green New Deal. She's been a real agenda setter on that topic, which I'm not sure she would have been had she not done that. So secondly, you have active players who are lawmakers who are sort of engaged in writing the bill itself, kind of the nitty gritty details of the bill. Again, this seems like a good place to be, and in a lot of ways it is, to wield a lot of power. However, your constituents who care a lot about an issue may wonder why you're not leading on that issue, right? So if you're kind of an active player and you keep your cards close to the vest on the Green New Deal, and you have very progressive district, very progressive constituents, they may wonder, why is this person who I'm voting for not as passionate about whatever this topic is as I am, right? And then finally, the concept of late deciders is a really interesting one. These people you may think are freeloading, right? They're free riding, they're part of the collective action problem. They are not willing to sacrifice any of their political capital in order to lead on an issue. The American people didn't elect members of Congress to follow, and so as a result, these people are wasting all of our time. In some ways, that's true. I understand that critique of this particular kind of decision maker. However, because they are such late deciders, they are particularly effective at extracting resources for in exchange for their support. And so one example I talked about here in Wednesday's lecture is this Cornhusker kickback, which was $100 million reimbursed by the federal government to the state of Nebraska simply to get Senator Ben Nelson's vote on Obamacare in 2010. And it was essentially a straight up bribe from the federal government to Nebraskans. And if he had come out as an early supporter of that law, he would not have, or of the bill rather, he would not have been in any position to negotiate that particular benefit for his constituents. The other thing that we talked about, or one of the other things that we talked about, is that not all votes are created equal, even though by definition they are, right? So a yes vote looks like a yes vote, a no vote looks like a no vote, and that is true, right? You cannot, I think I've mentioned this before, but you can't press the yes button really hard to demonstrate how much you care about an issue. You're either voting A or nay, right? Yet, if you pull back the curtain a little bit, yes and no votes have all sorts of hidden meanings, right? And lawmakers can have many, many differing motivations. They can vote yes for bills that they don't like. They can vote against bills that they do like. And I encourage you to go back to Wednesday's lecture slides to read a little bit more about this. But what this means is that for those of us who are interested in Congress, if we just sit in our offices or at our desks or in the library and study roll call votes, right, counting the yeses and counting the nos and treating them all equally, then we're really doing a disservice because we're not able to, with any sort of nuance at all, figure out why things are happening in Congress. And speaking of why things are happening the way that they happen in Congress, we talked about what we call the determinants of voting, right? So not only the act of voting itself, but what leads members of Congress to vote a certain way. And we've really got four kind of different things that we discuss. So the first are parties and ideology, both of which are super influential in the voting process. Members of Congress for sure think of themselves, I think most of them think of themselves at least as powerfully as members of a political party as they do as members of Congress, right? So if somebody asks who you are you going to say you're a congressman first, or are you going to say you're a Democrat first? And obviously, party is the biggest predictor on how a member of Congress will vote. Ideology is, of course, another big determinant, and ideology and party more and more ever since the conservative coalition comprised of Southern Democrats and Republicans has broken up, but party and ideology are what we call collinear, meaning that they vary together, right? Party unity is, of course, on the rise, and the moderate middle in American politics has shrunk. And then finally, members of Congress vote the way that they do, obviously, because they're constituents. That is, of course, another factor. Members of Congress, once they're elected, they want to continue to get elected. They also tend to care, regardless of whether the president is of their political party or not, they care about what the president is doing. If, of course, you're of the opposite political party than the president, you want to be really careful about coming out in favor of things that the president does. And similarly, if you're of the same party, then you want to be really careful about breaking with the president. So this decision-making process, just know there's a temporal aspect to it, right? So when do you get involved? How do you get involved, etc. And there are numerous reasons as to why members of Congress vote the way that they do. So we talked a little bit about this before, but this idea of the collective action problem talks about the challenge of trying to get people who have individual incentives to do things to allow groups to achieve. And this concept of collective action, y'all are no stranger to it, with group work and other sort of things, maybe your living situation in a non-coronavirus world, if you've got a bunch of roommates trying to figure out who's going to do what. And essentially, this is not the only way, but one of the only ways to overcome the problem of free riding and the collective action problem is through trading off goals and resources to get results. And one way you can do this is through bargaining. And this is the process by which two or more actors, in our case it's going to be members of Congress, arrive at what they would consider to be a mutually beneficial exchange. And in any good mutually beneficial exchange, each side can claim victory, and yet each side necessarily feels the sting of loss, right? Because if you didn't, you would not be compromising. Bargaining can be implicit, meaning it's just understood. We don't necessarily have to say that we're bargaining with each other, but that's clearly what we're doing. Or it can be explicit. Implicit bargaining is essentially taking actions that are designed to elicit specific reactions, even though no like formal or official negotiation has taken place. So for example, introducing a bill in order to prod action from somewhere else. This happens. This is a form of bargaining, even if nobody is calling it such. Explicit bargaining, on the other hand, involves political compromise. And as we know, we've talked about it a lot in class, political compromise in this Congress and more recent Congresses, where polarization is at an almost all-time high and majorities are very slim. Any sort of compromising is seen as a weakness, and actually increasingly among members of Congress, a fatal weakness. So what does bargaining look like then in sort of action? There's a term in American politics that you may be familiar with from some of your other courses called log rolling. And log rolling is essentially exchanging support so that all parties can attain individual goals, right? So something for everybody. And prominent examples here include bills on public works projects, agriculture projects, or agriculture subsidies and funding, tax bills, tariff bills, and trade bills. Typically a broad-based log roll, so a log roll that has kind of a critical mass of support, is very, very difficult to stop. And in fact, that's where the metaphor comes from. Once a log starts rolling down a hill, it's really, really difficult to stop because the system of rewards that kind of starts piling onto the log as it's rolling can grow to be pretty powerful. Log rolling, I should note, it's not just about increasing benefits for everybody, but it can also be about equalizing sacrifices, right? So it can be kind of a negative log roll. So for bargaining to work and for log rolling to work, members of Congress actually have to agree on the need for a legislative product in the first place, a bill, some kind of legislative remedy for a policy problem. And of course, parties wish to use their votes as efficiently as possible, and they want to win victories at the cheapest possible price. Unlike Obamacare, for example, which was no doubt a huge victory, but it was won at enormous costs. All right, so that's all I've got on decision making, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about Congress and the presidency. Um, and a lot of this should be review kind of as we move into discussing the relationship between Congress and the president. But as you know, um, the framers were incredibly ambivalent about executive power, right? So um, their kind of recent lived experience before the American Revolution had been under what they considered to be the tyrannical rule of King George of England. And so, as a result, when the time came to amend or replace the Articles of Confederation, which were really doomed from the start by not having enough executive power, the framers were still very leery to place too much power in the hands of a single person, or in the case of some proposals, three different people who would serve as a triumvirate. And so, as a result, we see that Article 2, which is the article that describes the executive branch in the Constitution, is much shorter and much more vague than Article 1. Article 1 wanted to give Congress a lot of power. And as a result, Article 2 is pretty different. Its most kind of important function, though, is that it kind of gives us the first example of how the Constitution blends both executive and legislative power. It's often been said that we live in a system of separate institutions sharing power. And the juxtaposition between Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution does a really nice job of showing us that. Um, so, as an example here, Congress, of course, has the ability to check the president in one of his most basic of functions, which is the nomination of appointees to agencies. Um, and then for his part, the executive, of course, can apply the veto, which is there. That's probably a word that all of you know what it means, but just in case you don't, that's where the president can choose to not sign a bill which has been passed by both houses of Congress and has then come to the president's desk. Um, as Woodrow Wilson said, overcoming a veto, which you need 2/3 of votes, but that overcoming a veto is so difficult that essentially the president these days, and Woodrow Wilson was writing this over 100 years ago, but these days the president is essentially the third branch of the legislature, because all the president has to do is threaten a veto, and the whole system grinds to a halt. So a presidential veto almost always stops a bill because a president can rally supporters in Congress to not override the bill. And in fact, less than 5% of all vetoes are actually overridden. The use of the veto has declined in recent presidencies. So Bush and Obama only issued 12 vetoes. Trump, comparatively, has not issued very many either. And these are the lowest figures since Warren Harding was president in the 1920s. There are a lot of reasons for a presidential veto, one of which is that it allows the president to, in a very sort of public break from Congress, underscore how his views are very different from the other party. Um, Congress can also sometimes send the president a measure that they know he will veto, so they can then burn him later for it, which you can think of as like a winning by losing strategy, right? If we know we're not going to get this bill signed into law, well, then we should call it something like Making America Better Bill or whatever it is, and then make sure it gets to the president's desk so that he can veto it, and then we can later in campaign commercials or whatever talk about how the president did not want to sign a bill that was a positive one. There are kind of 4 steps to the veto process. So the first step is that a president can just sign whatever bill is placed on his desk. And in fact, most bills are indeed signed by the president. Much of the bargaining, in fact, really almost all of the bargaining takes place before Congress votes. And so then obviously by extension before the bill gets to the president's desk. The president can also issue a signing statement, which signals his preferred interpretation of the language of the bill. but that is not a bound requirement. It's only just a preference, and it's obviously up to the Supreme Court to determine how and what language in a bill means. So if the president doesn't sign the bill, the president can then veto it. And if the president does that, then the bill goes back to the chamber where it originated. Vetoes, they're up, or I mean, rather, they're down. As we saw, Obama and Bush did it less than 5% of the time. And so vetoes are pretty rare. The president can also do nothing. So a president may expect an override if he were to veto, so he does nothing and the bill becomes law. The president can also employ what's called a pocket veto. So if Congress adjourns and that happens within 10 days, then the bill cannot become law. One phrase that y'all may have heard before is the line item veto. And so Congress passed what is called a line item veto measure in 1996. During the end of Bill Clinton's first term in office. And this allowed the president to veto specific items in a bill rather than an entire bill. And in 1998, the Supreme Court actually found the Line Item Veto Act to be unconstitutional, in large part because of the arguments put forth in Federalist 48, which concerns the separation of powers at the federal level in America. What the court's reasoning was that the line item veto bill essentially gave the president what amounts to unilateral authority to change the text of what are duly enacted statutes. So another version of the line item veto bill was actually passed by the House in 1996, and it was much weaker than the 96 version, but yet failed to pass in the Senate. So the final thing that I want to talk about today is this concept of the administrative president. So you can think of Congress, right, as an institution that has institutionalized over time. It's gotten bigger, it's gotten more complex. The decision making obviously is more universalistic, etc. But the presidency, despite being one person, is an institution of itself. So after Donald Trump is no longer president, of course, the institution of the presidency will remain. And it's true that every president, every single one, the good ones, the bad ones, the medium ones, whatever, have left their mark on the way that that office operates, right? So in terms of their administrative powers and in terms of sort of building the capacity of the institution, presidents can obviously issue executive orders. They can make proclamations to outside groups. They can establish new national monuments. They can make modifications to tariffs. Just ask the EU or China or Canada or any of the other countries that Trump has started little trade skirmishes with. Presidents can also negotiate executive agreements with other countries, which is sort of a bypassal or a bypassing of the treaty process. They can commit to trade deals, and they can obviously issue directives changing policy on a lot of different things: war on drugs, terror, COVID-19, whatever. And the point of this is that as kind of an administrative institution, right, as a site of administrative power, the president does not need support from Congress to put forth this kind of effort. So one example here, and many of y'all are writing about the Patriot Act, but one example is President Bush, who in the wake of 9/11 basically unilaterally created a federal agency called the Office for Homeland Security. And Office for Homeland Security, which still exists today, constructed prison, Camp X-Ray down in Guantanamo Bay for suspected terrorists. They instituted a new legal system for dealing with enemy combatants, trying to figure out whether or not to try enemy combatants in military tribunals or put them kind of at the mercy of the civil court system in America. So between World War II then and 1995, presidents unilaterally created more than half of all administrative agencies in the U.S., and Congress actually very rarely attempts to overturn executive orders, and when it tries, it often fails. And so it seems like the president, really no matter who the president has been, has been, if you think of political power as a pie, they've been not only taking a slice for themselves, but they have also been cutting into other pies as well, right? And taking a little bit more power for themselves. We'll talk more um, about this on Wednesday, but for now, this is all I've got for today. So again, I hope that you are having a great day, and I hope that you are finding these videos helpful, if not enjoyable, at least helpful. So the final thing I wanted to mention is if you have advising questions, I know that advising opened up last week for seniors, and it opens up for juniors tomorrow, I think. But please don't hesitate to email me, and I will get back to you as soon as we can, and we can find a time to chat on the phone or via Zoom if you've got kind of longer questions. So that's it. Stay safe, be well, and I'll talk to you Wednesday.